Hello, this is Dr. Alan Wegg from Stress and Anxiety Services of New Jersey. So if you treat persons with OCD, you already know, of course, that obsessions are intrusive impulses, thoughts, or images that intrude upon the consciousness of the client, creating anxiety and uncertainty, and then they purposely engage in compulsive behaviors as a way of trying to neutralize that anxiety, or have compulsive thoughts that provide the same relief. Sometimes also there's just the avoidance of behaviors as a way of not triggering the OCD altogether. And of course the treatment of choice is exposure response prevention. But sometimes OCD can get tricky and can actually compromise the exposure intervention and like hijack it and incorporate it into the compulsion cycle itself. So for instance, I worked with a client who had to very compulsively he had one of these racks with lots of dowels on them, and he would hang his newspapers in a very specific order, all facing the same way, and he spent a lot of time making sure that it was equidistant from each side, etc. So the intervention, of course, was I modeled for him first with his permission, and I would take like the third newspaper, and I would turn it around, and then I would take the sixth newspaper, I would turn it upside down and then turn it around, and down the line I did like three or four of those kind of changes, and then I asked him to go and make the same changes. And while I watched him do it, I noticed that he was really doing it very slowly, and then when I asked him about his anxiety levels and doing this exposure, they were very, very low. And I couldn't really understand that, and I said, what's going on? And he said, well, he noticed that the third one, I turned it this way, and the sixth one, I turned it this way, and the eighth one, I turned it this way, and then he just repeated that pattern. So what ended up happening is the OCD took the exposure therapy and incorporated it into his ritual of how he hung newspapers. The bottom line is that when you're working with clients who have OCD, when you're doing the exposure therapy, you want to check on their subjective units of discomfort or distress, the SUDS level, in terms of their anxiety. And if it's very low, you also want to check to make sure that there isn't something else going on. If the OCD has in some way incorporated the exposure therapy, then you need to pivot and make changes in the exposure. So for instance, with this guy that I was working with, I basically had him do it over again, and this time he did it very, very quickly, and we worked on it being very, very random. But of course, even then, the OCD could kind of study it if he looked at it carefully and see some kind of pattern in it. So what we ended up doing is we did it 3 times, and each time he moved around 1 or 2 things differently, and the next day he changed it up again, so it was always different from the previous time. So there was always some kind of pattern, but we kept changing it. At a certain point, it became very difficult for the OCD to incorporate it into some kind of compulsive structure because we were changing it all the time. So that's just one idea. Stay tuned for other ways to deal with surprises when it comes to obsessions and compulsions.